Hello and welcome to Monday's edition of Cracking the Cryptic. And on screen we've got a puzzle by Stephane Bura. Stephane's been publishing puzzles for a while now on Logic Masters Germany, and I always look out for his puzzles because they have very unusual rule sets. He is a real innovator, and his puzzles tend to get very high ratings and normally very high difficulty rankings as well. But this puzzle might be the exception to the rule. It's got a very interesting rule set. I've certainly never seen anything like it before. It's called Pivot Sudoku, and you can see it's got a very arresting looking grid. But I sent it over to Mark and asked him to test it to see what it might be like for a solve of the channel. Now Mark is, we have to point out, notoriously unreliable in such matters. Indeed, the last time he reported back that a puzzle was approachable, it turned out to be the most monstrous puzzle in Christendom, and yeah, it gave me a right headache. But he says this puzzle is approachable, and we have Logic Masters Germany to sort of back that up. It gets 3 stars out of 5 for difficulty on Logic Masters Germany, which means it really ought to be approachable. And if you are relatively new to the channel or new to Sudoku variations, and you're looking for a puzzle to cut your teeth on, then this might be a very good one to choose. Yeah, and it's also a relief to know that on this occasion at least, we can trust what the fiend says. Now, what are the rules? Well, the rules are normal Sudoku rules apply. Now, this is the complicated bit. If a cell contains arrows and its digit is n, the sum totals of the n digits in the directions of the arrows of the same colour are all equal. For a given cell, arrows of different colours point to different sum totals, and all the possible arrows are given. Now, that is it sounds complicated, but I actually think it's not too bad, because let's pick an example. Let's look at the arrows coming out of this square. Let's imagine this square it had a 3 in it. Then what the rules are saying is that we look at we look 3 cells in the directions of the arrows. So we look at northern arrows, we go 3 cells, these 3 cells, and eastern arrows, the eastern arrow points at those 3 cells. And what we now know is that these 3 cells, the sum of these 3 cells is equal to the sum of these 3 cells. And if this was a 2, it would be that the sum of those 2 cells is equal to the sum of those 2 cells. If this was a 1, well, it can't be a 1, because if it's a 1, that would be saying the sum of this cell is equal to the sum of this cell, which is saying that they both contain the same digit, which is not allowed. So I think I understand that. Now, of course, there are some cells that have red and grey arrows. Let's imagine this was a 3. So that would be saying those 3 squares, looking at the grey arrows first, these 3 squares, these 3 squares, and these 3 squares would have to have the same sum. And then the red arrows, not the planes, the red arrows in the grid, they're pointing at those 3 cells each. So these would have to have the same sum as well, but they would have to have a different sum to whatever the grey arrows happen to have. So yeah, cells with red arrows and grey arrows get a bit complicated, but I think I understand the basic principle. Do have a go at the puzzle. To play it, you just click on the link under the video as usual, and that will take you to our software where you can play on whichever device is your preference. And with that, let's get cracking. Now, my one thought for starting this puzzle is to try and pick off arrows that are pointing at an edge that's close to them, like this square. Look, that's pointing at this edge. So this can't have a 3 in it, because there aren't 3 cells above it. So it's got to be, this square's got to be a 1 or a 2. And in fact, it can't be a 1, because if it's a 1, that cell and that cell would have to be the same digit, because the arrows are pointing at these cells and they would share a column, and that would break the rules of Sudoku. So this is a 2. And now we know those cells and these cells have the same sum as those cells and those cells have the same sum, but it's a different sum. Okay, so but this square also has an arrow pointing east, look. So this square can only be a 1 or a 2, and it can't be a 2, so that is a 1. And there are a plethora of arrows coming off this square, look. It's saying that the grey arrows, so those 3 squares have to be the same digit now, and those 2 squares have to be the same digit. which might mean we should highlight these. Will I highlight? I will highlight. Let's be sensible. So I'll make these grey cells are saying these have to be the same colour. I'll make these purple. Is that very distinct? So the purple cells also have to be the same colour. Okay, so what now? Well, this square, look, that's pointing vertically. So this square has to be a 1, 2 or a 3, and it can't be a 1. So this has got to be a 2 or a 3. And this, yeah, okay. And now my highlighting is immediately useful, because if this has to be a 2 or a 3, we know it's the same as that square, which has to be a 2 or a 3, and that one can't be a 2. So that makes them both 3s. And maybe I'll get rid of the highlighting now, because I don't need it anymore. So there's a 3 down in one of those squares. Oh, look, this square is just pointing at the edge of the grid all but. So this square only sees one square going eastwards, so it must be a 1. There's a 1 down here now. Okay, so what else can we do here? This square is looking that way, so this has to be this has to be 1, 2 or 3, and it can't be a 1 because it has arrows pointing up and down. So this is a 2 or a 3. This one, that could be a maximum of 3 and can't be a 1 because it has arrows pointing at those two squares. So this is a 2 or a 3. This one, again, this has arrows pointing down and arrows pointing sort of at those two squares, so it can't be a 1. It can't be a 1 for that reason as well. So this is a 2 or a 3. So there's a 2, 3 pair in this box. This square has an arrow pointing diagonally downwards, but only 2 cells. So this has to be a 1 or a 2. Okay, and alright, this square is a little bit restricted because it can see 4 squares in its vertical direction. So it's got to be 1, 2, 3 or 4, and it can't be 1 and 3. So this is a 2 or a 4. But this can't be a 4 by parity. That's lovely. Look, let's look at these 4 squares. If this is a 4, these 4 squares and these 4 squares have to sum to the same number. But whether this sum of 4 squares is odd or even, the sum of 2 odd numbers is even, the sum of 2 even numbers is even. So I'm going to add an even number to the number 4. I'm going to get, therefore, an even number for the whole column. But the whole column adds to 45 because it will contain all of the digits from 1 to 9. Therefore, there's no way this can be a 4 because that would force this column to add to an even number, which we know it doesn't. So this is a 2. This is a 3 now. That's a 2. That's a 2. And we run out of steam again, but that felt important. Oh, this one's got an arrow pointing at the side of the grid as well. So this has to be a 1 or a 2 because it can't be higher than a 2, and it can't be a 1, look, because it's got arrows pointing to those 2 squares. So that has to be a 2. There has to be a 2 in one of those 2 cells. This has to be a 1 now. So now those 2 cells have to be the same number. Now that's important because, look, this square sees those 4 cells, so it's a maximum of a 4, and it can't be a 1, 2 or a 3 because it sees all of those. So this is a 4, and this is a 4. And okay. Now, I'm not sure again. Ah, look, there's an interesting... Yeah, that is interesting. Grey here, grey here. So whatever we put in the grey cells has to make an appearance in one of those three squares. But whatever I put in this square can't be a 1, 2 or a 3. So there is a number that is not 1, 2 and 3 in these squares. So it's not possible for this to be a 2. Because if this is a 2, you can see I will have the numbers 1, 2 and 3 in these squares, which is impossible because I need to put a number that is not 1, 2 and 3 in the squares, if you see what I mean. So this can't be a 2. The 2 must be on this side. So there's a 2 in one of those squares by Sudoku, and we need to put something in here that's equal to whatever is a grey number. I like this puzzle. This is very interesting. It's a bit mental the way you have to scan. You have to scan in a very peculiar way, but oh, this can't be a 1. That can't be a 1 because if it's a 1, those two squares have to be the same. In fact, where does a 1 go in the bottom row of the grid? You've got to be really careful with putting 1s on arrows because they basically... You can see if we try and put a 1 on either of those arrows, we immediately break the box by having a repeated digit. Same is true of this square. Same is true of this square. This could be a 1. That can't be a 1 because of the 1 there. Right, yeah, so there's actually only one place for a 1 in the bottom row, and that is there, which is in fact completely useless. But it was still a little bit interesting. Okay. Right, so where do we look now? We've got an absolute multitude of arrows coming out of this square. Yeah, okay, well there's a little bit of a restriction I can see to do with the red arrows, look. So these two cells and these two cells have the same sum, but there's a 3 in this sum and a 2 in this sum. So whatever I put in this cell has to be exactly 1 less than whatever I put in this cell. So this square has to be, can't be 1, 2, 3 or 4. It's got to be 5, 6, 7 or 8, and this has to be 6, 7, 8 or 9. But this 1... yeah, we can do some highlighting with the 1, look, because that's pointing at all sorts of cells. That cell and that cell have to be equal. And this cell have to be equal. So if this is a 5, 6, 7 or 8, this square is a 5, 6, 7 or 8. There's just so many so much interdependence between these three clues. You've got arrows pointing between them at each other. Yeah, look at this one. This one is pointing at that that 2 cell sequence. So if this was a 9, these 2 cells sum to 11. But that's a grey arrow pointing at 11, and those 2 cells would also have to therefore sum to 11, which they can't. Not unless I can put a 10 in that square, which is impossible. So this is not 9, which means that's not 8. And if that's not 8, that's not 8. And... okay. So maybe... yeah, maybe we keep going with this. If this is 8, we know those 2 squares add to 10, so this would be a 9. These add to 10, this would be a 7. If this is 7, this is an 8, therefore, and this is a 6. If this is 6, these add to 8. This has got to be a 7, sorry, and this has got to be a 5. Yeah, it's really weird. So basically, whatever is in this square mirrors in this square because of the effect this total has on this square and the fact this has to be one less. That is bizarre. So I can label that green as well. All of these squares have to contain the same digit. So this is a 3 total. That's a bit less useful, I think. Oh, look though, this 2 sees both of these squares. And it sees both... yeah, here we go. So, can this be a 5? If this is a 5, this domino adds up to 6. Well, I can't make that domino add to 6 without repeating the 3. So this is not 5. And if that's not 5, neither of those are 5. And if this can't be 5, this can't be 6. So we're getting to a point where this is getting more restricted. Now, if this can't be 5 and this can't be 6, this can't be 7. So if this is 6 now, these add up to 7, these would have to add up to 7, this would have to be a 4. And if this was a 7, these would add up to 8, this would have to be a 5. And and there we go. Look, this is a grey cell. So whatever I put in this square gets mirrored in those 2 squares. Well, this square can't be a 4. In effect, this cell here sees this cell here, which is very, very odd, but it is true. So this has to be 5, I think. That has to be 5. That has to be 5. There's a 5 up there. 5 now, it lives down here to create a 1, 3, 5 triple. In fact, let's label that up so we don't forget it. That one can't be the 1. Yeah, this is nice. This is nice because this domino sums to 8. So this domino has to sum to 8, which means this is a 7. The 7 is green, so these 2 become 7. That's 8 now. We know that the sum we're looking for is 10, so these 2 have to be adding up to 10. That has to be a 9. So what do we need down here? We need 4, 6 and 9 into those squares. Let's have a look at that. Oh, this can't be a 9. In fact, you can never have a 9. You can never have a 9 on an arrow because any cell in the grid sees a maximum of 8 cells. Even if we look at a corner cell, if we look at this square and ask how many cells does it see, it sees a maximum of 8. So this is just not 9, that's not right. This one is okay. No, this one is useful. This one is very useful because of the red arrows here. These 2 squares add to the same as those 2 squares. But the maximum I could make these 2 squares would be 11 if I make that a 9. So there's no way that this can contain a 6 or a 9 because these 2 would add up to too high a value. In fact, look, that's got to be a 4, which means that's got to be a 4 because they're both red. This square's got to be a 9 now to make it add up to 11. The red arrow pointing this way has to add up to 11. Well, it can't be 2, 9, 3, 8 or 4, 7. These have to be 5 and 6. Which we can't resolve, look, but we do get a 1 in the middle box as a result of Sudoku. We get a 1 up here by Sudoku. These squares have got to be 4, 8 and 9. I'm not sure we know the order, but we shall put them in. 4, that can't be 9. Yeah, we can do more though with this red arrow now. Because that red arrow is looking at those 2 squares, so I can't make this an 8 because these 2 would then have to add up to 15, and I can't make that domino add up to 15. So this has to be a 4, which means that one's a 7, look, because basically we're saying these 2 have to contain the same digits now. It's a bizarre puzzle. Bizarre, but very enjoyable. 6, 8, 9 into those squares. Now, can we resolve any of those? These 2 squares have got to be 9 and 6. But we've got the 8, 9 pair here. So we get the 9, we get the 6. That square's interesting all of a sudden. That becomes an 8. These two squares have got to be 2 and 7 up in the corner there. That being a 4 fixes a 6 down there. That's got to be a 9, and we are starting to do not too badly. Yeah, look at this 6. We can sort of do geometry here. This 6 is pointing at those 6 squares and at these 6 squares. So we know in effect that this column is missing a 5 and a 9. So we have to hide the same digits behind the 6 in this row. So the 9 and the 5 are forced. That gives us a 1, 3. That square's got to be an 8 by Sudoku. These squares ought to be resolvable a bit now. We can see they're 4 and 6, but we don't know the order. Ah, but this 2, this can't be a 2, because if it's a 2, we'd need 14 in both directions, and that can't add to 14, so that's a 7, that's a 2. 2 lives over on this side of the grid. I'm struggling to keep track of the which arrows I've used, I have to confess. I'm not sure. I've not really used this one at all. You can see the left or the right arrows add up to 18. These add up to 18. These 3 squares have to add up to 18 as well, but I'll never remember that. I'm going to highlight them. Also, we've got the similar thing going on vertically and diagonally. These have to be 6 and 8 in some order. It's probably something I can do to resolve those, but I'm not sure what it is. The 5 in the corner now sees those squares. Ah, yeah, there you go. There you go, look. That's lovely. So these squares include a 1, 6 and a 9. So the missing digit, or the extra digits in this run of 5 squares are 3 and 4, which add up to 7. Which means these 2 squares have to also add up to 7 to preserve the rules, but they can't be they can't involve a 1 or a 2. So these 2 squares have to be 3 and 4, and there's a 4 there. So this is a 4, this is a 3. These 2 squares are 7 and 8 to complete the row. That can't be an 8 because it only sees 7 cells in that direction. So that's got to be a 7, that's got to be an 8. 8 in the corner. 8 in the corner always has to have arrows, doesn't it? Okay, so now how do we do better? These 4 squares add up to 20, so these 4 squares have to add up to 20. That's probably a way of result. These, there's also so much going on here. This 2... the 2 is useful. Look, the 2 is useful because those 2 squares, well, if this is a 5, these would add up to 12, and I can't make those 2 squares add up to 12, even if I pick 5 and 8. So this has to be a 6. So we're now looking to make these 2 add up to 13. There's only one way that will work. 5, 8, 9. These have to add up to 13 because of the grey arrow going south. But they can't use 4, 9 or 5, 8. So these are 6, 7. There's a 7 over here. So 7 and 6 get placed. These squares here have got to be 5 and 8. And the 8 and the 5 get placed. So there's a 5 over there. Oh, look. Yeah, look. Oh, we've got the mark of the beast appearing in the puzzle. Look, we've got the 3 here pointing at the 7, 2, 9, which add up to 18. And this 3 here, rather naughtily, pointing down this diagonal. I need to make this diagonal add up to 18 as well. Well, to do that, I've got to do that. And there we go, 666 makes an appearance. Didn't think I'd say that on Cracking the Cryptic, but dearie me, how unusual. We get a 9 and a 1 here to complete this column. These squares have got to be 3 and 7. That's useful. We can do that. 7 and 3. 3, 3. There's got to be a 3 in one of these 3 squares at the top. Those 2 squares have got to be 2 and not 2 and 4. What is it? 2 and 7. There's a 7 at the bottom of the grid. 7, 2. That makes that one a 2. I'm sure there's loads of these arrow or yeah, look at this one. I've not used this. Yeah, okay. These 2 add up to 15. These 2 have to add up to 15, so that's got to be 9. These 2 squares here have got to be 6 and 8, which is now resolved. That fixes the 6 and the 9 there, gives us a 9 here. These 2 squares have got to be 3 and 5, I think. I'm wondering whether the 3 will... Yeah. This 3 is nice. If this is a 3, they add up to 22. They can't add up to 22, so we've got to make that a 5. That becomes a 3. Tidy up pencil marks at the top. The 5 is going to give us the value of this square, look, because if we add up those squares there, you can see we get 14 and 13 is 27. I need to make sure these add up to 27. At the moment they only add up to 24, so we need to put a 3 in the corner. Those 2 squares have got to include a 1. The 5 is finished. We can place the 1 here. We need a 1 and a 4. That is doable. 4, 1. The 1 is right, because look at that. It's got 2 5s it's pointing at. And that square should be a 3, I think, which is very important because that's going to resolve our 3 and a 1 over there. Let's check this 3 works. So we've got 18 in that direction and 18 in that direction. It does. And note that this 3 didn't involve 666. It's just adjacent to it. Now let's look up here. We can see we need 4 and 5, which is resolved. 5 and 4, the 4 and the 6 and the 8, and we are, I think, closing in on a solution. If I can place a 1 here, let's check this 5 is right. That's pointing down there. 8, 12, 23. So these should add to 23, and they do. So I think this is correct. Check. Yes. What a lovely, lovely puzzle that is. That is very unusual. And of course, what I'm not going to do is to check every single cell in this puzzle to see whether it's missing arrows that would be required. I don't envy Stephane that job of invoking the negative constraint, but apparently it exists in the puzzle. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. Do let me know in the comments, and we'll be back later with another edition of Cracking the Cryptic.